I make it 7 o'clock. Let's make a start. Normally at this point, I'd say hello, everyone. I'm Tim Freddo, and welcome to this season's Adventurous In Conversation. But it's just me and Jon and Roman, and that's a technical issue on my part. Being a bookseller, I can't really cope with anything beyond turning the folds in a page. So apologies to those of you who aren't watching this live. It's going to be a great conversation. I'm ever so sorry you missed it. Jon, Roman, thank you so much for making time to join me. We had to do a lot of juggling, which is why Jon is sat in a hotel room in Brussels. Roman's desperately trying to persuade him to go out to a jazz bar. I think he's sold. So at least one of us is going to have a night that improves from here. Me, I'm going to go and drown my sorrows at the end of this. I'm not going to lie. So our books this month are. This season are Histories for Tomorrow, Roman's book, and Jon's book, Citizens. And I put the two together because I feel that they're kind of speaking to each other. So Roman very much delves into how have things been done differently in the past, when Jon really picks it up right now in the here and now and says we've been telling ourselves the wrong story. We need to tell ourselves a different story. So those are the stories that we're going to get into this evening. But as a starter for 10, Jon has very handily at the back of Citizens, he's very handily put some questions for discussion and reflection. So we're going to start with one of Jon's questions. And I
can't remember what these are, so this will be a nice surprise.
So I'm going to go with, where did you learn what it means to be good? Sorry, where do we learn what it means to be good, and where did you learn it? So where did we learn what it means to be good, and where did you learn it? So it's your question, Jon. I'm going to ask you first.
I mean, the reason, maybe I'll explain a little bit why the reason behind the question. I think my underlying argument, or sort of the basic premise in my work is two things, really. The first is that humans are citizens by nature, is the language I would use. I believe we are collaborative, creative, caring creatures, all of us. But the second is that we are storytelling and story-dwelling creatures, that we can't help but live within the parameters of story. And the stories that surround us shape who we collaborate with, what we care about, what we create, because we draw on them to understand what it means to be good. And we all want to be good, but the stories that we draw what it means to be good from are sometimes really bad. And for me, this comes super alive, right? Because I started my career working in the advertising industry. And my first boss described my job to me by saying, what you've got to remember is the average consumer sees 3,000 commercial messages a day, and you have to cut through that. You have to make yours the best. And that was what it meant to be good, right? And I by doing that, I was contributing, or like, according to the logic of the story, at least, of the consumer story, as I call it. By doing that, I would be making a contribution to the flourishing of society. The logic of what I call the consumer story is that if everyone pursues their own self-interest, then that will add up to the collective interest. The Milton Friedman saying the social responsibility of businesses to maximize its profits is a direct expression of consumer logic. Friedman wasn't saying business should stick a load of money in its ears and fuck everyone else. Sorry, grown-ups podcast.
Language is fine. Welcome.
He was saying that is the right thing to do, and that's my kind of key point. Like, the logic of the consumer story, what I would see as the story that sort of shaped us and surrounded us now anywhere between 3,000 and 10,000 times a day, is that to be good is to contribute to, frankly, to economic growth, to consume, to pursue self-interest, because that will add up to the collective interest. And I learned that story pretty wholeheartedly, being a very successful kind of posh boy, going through nice school and nice university, and being terribly good at sport, and tumbling out into the advertising industry, and only started to wake up to that story being pretty flawed / evil rather too late, arguably. And so I think I guess that holding that is a way of saying like people. I don't believe that we live in a moment in the times we do with the crises we face because people are. Because humanity is flawed, I believe we live in the times we do and with the crises we face because the story that we are trapped within is flawed.
So, John, I'm just going to suggest a small addition to your questions here. You need a 4A where you say, what does it mean to be good? No, where do we learn what it means to be good? Brackets, and what does it mean to be good? Because there are different definitions of good, aren't there? And you were following that established form of what goodness means. It's success, growth, power, all that stuff.
Yeah, and I think I guess that the to complete round out the sort of the framework of ideas that I work with, the sort of I talk about seeing the world through the lens of three stories of the individual and society: subject, consumer, and citizen. And all three of those are ideas of what it means to be good. If I introduce them tiptoeing into Roman Krznaric territory as a kind of historical framework, I would like end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, we were something like subjects. The story that surrounded us was that the right thing to do, that what it meant to be good was to keep our heads down, do as we were told, get what we were given, because there were a God-given few who knew best, and they would lead us. And so to be good was to do as you were told. Coming out of the two world wars, we constructed the consumer story that I've talked about. And now I believe what we're living in is the collapse of that story. The consumer story is falling apart because actually the challenges of our time are the consequences of it, rather than being sort of they're features rather than bugs. Like you can't solve a crisis of loneliness and mental health from within a story that says that being good is being an independent, isolated individual. You can't solve crisis of inequality from within a story that says being good is competing and rising above the other. And you can't solve ecological crises from within a story that says that being good is being separate from nature and piling up material possessions, because the story created the crisis. And as that story collapses, the subject story is back because the certainty of the strongman leader is very appealing when things don't make sense anymore. But at the same time, there's a much deeper, and actually, I think Roman and I would probably agree, much older story of the individual in society, which I offer the language of citizen to be a useful shorthand, but by no means a complete version. But that story is a story that says actually the right thing to do to be good is not just to keep your head down, nor is it to pursue self-interest. To be good is to contribute your ideas and energy and resources to the pursuit of the best outcomes for society, and to reimagine and possibly create new institutions that are designed to tap into that collective energy, wisdom, and resource. Because actually, the logic that underpins that idea of what it is to be good is that all of us are smarter than any of us, and that's how the best society will result. And that, as I say, that's a much deeper, much older story. Really, you can trace it back into indigenous wisdoms and cultures. You can see it rising at different moments throughout history and across the world, I think. But it's one that is not dominant as an idea of what it is to be good today, because it's very hard to be dominant, for that to rise to dominance in the context of 3 to 10,000 commercial messages a day that are all carrying the implicit message that to be good is to be a consumer.
Amazing. And John, you've trailed basically everything that we're going to pick up on. So I'm really looking forward to delving into all of that stuff. Roman, can I ask you the same question? So where do we learn to be good, and where did you learn to be good, or what good looks like? Especially speaking as someone who wrote a book called The Good Ancestor, which was amazing.
I certainly think I'm still on the journey of learning to being good. Um, it's a process. And where my mind goes to when thinking about that question is actually to my children, um, and to the concept of empathy, or what psychologists sometimes call cognitive empathy or perspective taking empathy, the capacity to put yourselves in the shoes of another person and see the world through their eyes. It seems to me that this is fundamental to being good. It's about extending beyond the straitjacket of our own ego. So why my children? Well, when my kids were about 2 years old, I've got twins, boy-girl twins. when my son was crying, his sister would try to comfort him with her favorite toy dog, which was a kind and sympathetic gesture, but not much use to him. But when they're about 4 years old, when their empathic capacity to step into the mind of another, the shoes of another, had developed, it happens in all kids. By the time they're 4, when my son was crying, his sister would go and comfort him with his favorite toy cat. Okay, that is the cognitive leap of empathy. It's understanding that other people don't necessarily see the world in the same way that you do. And it seems to me that this is fundamental for being good. And so when I think about my own journey of being good, the flawed journey of being good, it's these moments of seeing the world from another perspective. So, for example, in the 1990s, I spent quite a lot of time working with indigenous Mayan communities in Guatemala, and I was immersed in a completely different culture. It was a time of civil war, malnutrition, drought. I saw children dying in front of me. And when you see those other perspectives, it changes your whole perspective of your own life, of course. And sometimes those experiences stay with you, sometimes they don't. But for me, those moments in Guatemala, being in the jungle, living with communities, gunfire overhead, you kind of think like, whatever worries I have are pretty minuscule, compared to what other people are experiencing. Or another example, I live in the city of Oxford, and just down the street over there's a street I used to walk down all the time. I used to walk past this homeless guy who I thought was a kind of crazy old homeless guy. He'd be wearing multiple jackets at the same time in the middle of the summer, or wearing no shoes in winter in the snow, picking up cigarette butts. And I never thought I had much in common with him. And one day I stopped to talk with this guy, and he explained in his own words he was a paranoid schizophrenic with a history of violence. But then as we continue the conversation, I discovered we had a lot of things in common. For example, that we both studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford University, and that we had a shared love of Nietzsche, Aristotle, and pepperoni pizza, though I'm now a vegetarian, but I wasn't back then. And of course, again, this was another empathy moment, recognizing that the way we label people, the stereotypes we have about others, distance us from other people. So I think for me, being good, I mean, of course, we could have a million philosophical debates about what it means. But a fundamental part is that escaping from the straitjacket of our own egos to connect with others through seeing other perspectives. And one final thing I just say here in terms of why my own journey continues. So just out the window, over the top of the screen I'm looking at, there are 2 big ash trees. Now, I understand on a kind of scientific level that those ash trees provide enough oxygen for 8 human beings. They are my external lungs. In other words, I don't end just at the edge of this body here. I'm completely integrated with those trees. Just like I'm breathing in argon atoms, which were breathed in by Cleopatra and the Buddha, and generations to come. But even though I know those trees are outside and provide the oxygen that I breathe, and they really are me and I am them, I'm not sure I really feel it at the deepest level. In other words, there are boundaries to my goodness because I haven't fully embodied the idea of, or embraced the idea of kind of interbeing on its deepest levels, right? So this is also part of the journey. But I would say one final thing on top of that. I think Jon's perspective is very important to understand the narratives we get caught in, because the way we think about the good is absolutely a product of culture. I did my PhD in sociology. These ideas are inheritances of the past. They are inheritances of the first shop department stores, which were Bon Marché department store, which emerged in Paris in the 1870s and 1880s, which taught us to shop. It taught us I shop, therefore I am. And as Jon's work has shown so very clearly, we're having to fight hard to shake off the baggage of all of that inheritance. But that's where I begin anyway, with thinking about the good.
Beautiful. Thank you both. And I love, Jon, how you had that focus on stories, and Roman, you've got that focus on perspectives. And both of you were there talking about how we use story and perspective as a way to find connection to the things that we've lost. And that's what we're doing through Adventurous Inc. We're looking for a connection with ourselves, a connection with each other, and a connection with the rest of the natural world, which you've both spoken to beautifully. And speaking of connection, welcome to those members of our community who managed to find their way in. I can say sorry in person now. Sorry for whatever technological fail it was that prevented you all joining us at the start. And well done. That's all I can say to those of you who have made it in. Yeah, thank you for joining. So we talked there about the power of the story, and how we're all constrained by these cultural narratives that we bring with us. I wanted to talk about how we convey and communicate those, but because you've both got these big ideas that you wanted to share, and in this world of an infinite different ways to communicate ideas, you both chose to write it down in a book, which delights me, obviously, as a bookseller. Why did you choose a book? Either of you.
Go ahead, Jon.
I mean, in some ways, I don't feel like I really chose to write a book. I feel like I had to. I think I might choose to write another one, but sometimes the way I express this is like, I feel like these ideas have me rather than I have them. And it was more for me about, I have to get this stuff out of my head because it feels like an offer. It feels like a way of seeing the moment we're living in that can be helpful. And I can see that it's helpful when I do. Before I wrote the book, I could see that it was helpful to individual clients at New Citizen Project, the consultancy that I founded. And I could see that it was helpful to people I'd have individual conversations with, but I hadn't got something that gave me an authority, I guess. There's this horrendous / wonderful phrase: when you're an author, you're an authority. And also I hadn't fully pursued the ideas through, so I wasn't standing on solid enough ground in a lot of those conversations. And honestly, that's a bit where I feel I am again now with the next level of work, is that I feel like I'm having a similar level of frustration in the arguments I'm getting into. And so the reason I wrote a book was because I guess I do also love books and reading, despite my current background in my sterile hotel room in Brussels, feeling deeply envious of both of you with your artistic context. But ultimately it was because I wrote the book because I felt I had to. It was like, I have to pursue these ideas through. I have to get them out of my head. I have to get them out into the world. And there was nothing else I could think of to do that would do it with the same power. And I think, and now, like I'm starting work on a second book. The working title is A Citizen Manifesto. It's basically a project to try and articulate a politics that is rooted in what I call the citizen story, as opposed to the stories of subject or consumer. The reason why I believe it's worth writing a book for that purpose is because I think I do believe that sort of sincere major political projects need books to hold them. I think they always have done. Roman might contradict me, and if he does, then I'll take it, because he knows this world far better than me, or knows the history of it far better than me. But that's my take, is that you look back and there's something that holds together the proposition that's involved, and I think we're lacking it. I think my analysis of, riding off this question into my analysis of the current political moment would be that the world is sliding into fascism, but it's not sliding into fascism because people are fascist. It's sliding into fascism because the only options people are being offered are stick or twist, where stick is completely invalid and manifestly incapable of facing the challenges of our time, and twist is fascism. And so there has to be, and in a consumer democracy where all you have is the choice between a fixed set of options that someone else has articulated, people being given a choice between a stick they can't possibly believe in and a twist that's fascism are choosing fascism.
Wow. We'll come back to that. I was going to ask you both to describe this moment, and Jon, I think you've done it. You've done it beautifully there. Roman, I'm really interested in as a serial book writer. I'm interested in your thoughts on writing a book, and about how books differ from oral storytelling, and the sort of linearity of a book versus the cyclic nature of oral storytelling. But go on. Why did you want to write a book, Roman?
Well, I guess I write books because I'm addicted to writing books, and I no longer have the skills to do anything else. Um, every 3 or 4 years, a new book comes. Uh, but of course, why do I do it? Um, Ultimately, it's also not just because of addiction and compulsion. And actually, you know what it really partly is. If I'm not writing a book, I feel like I'm wasting my life, which sounds ridiculous because I know that books are just one of many ways to influence the world. I mean, I haven't just written books. I've started museums. I helped start something called the School of Life. I started a museum called the Empathy Museum, which travels around the world. So I do other stuff, but really it's books. Why? Because I believe in the power of ideas to create change. And one of the best ways to convey ideas is through the written word. And as I get older, I can look back at the impact of my previous books. Some of them have totally failed to change the public conversation. Other ones, like my previous book, The Good Ancestor, has had a lot of impact, in various ways. It's been quoted in Supreme Court judgments in the High Court of Pakistan to stop the expansion of the cement industry. There are movements which have picked it up as their name. I was on a call last week with people from the European Commission who are creating a intergenerational solidarity index to measure long-term public policy impact as an alternative to GDP. But they've taken the idea that because I created an index for that in my book, The Good Ancestor, and they're taking it on and adapting it and so on. So I know that ideas make a difference. I mean, with my new book, History for Tomorrow, I have dreams of the way the ideas in this book will impact the world. Whether that will happen, I don't know, because this is a book about how history can help us reshape society. In the book, it starts with the story of John F. Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it turned out that he was very influenced by a history book when making his decisions. He was influenced by a book called The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, which was a book about how, in Tuchman's analysis, in the First World War, the various Western powers stumbled into the war through accident and misconception and blundering. And he basically had this moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis when he realized, he thought, oh my God, we could be doing the same thing. I don't want someone to look back from the future and say, write a book called The Missiles of October, just like The Guns of August. And the evidence suggests that Kennedy was more conciliatory towards the Soviet Union and Khrushchev because he had read that book and didn't want to repeat what had happened. There's a very concrete instance there of a book making a difference. So I love examples like that because I think, right, this is why I'm writing a book too. But unlike the Kennedy example, which is all about high politics, I'm much more with Jon on this. This book, History of Tomorrow, is about what history can teach us about citizen action, social movements, expanding the commons, the foundations of social innovation as opposed to technological innovation. I think we focus way too much on thinking that it's tech innovation which really matters, from the spinning jenny to the iPhone. No, actually, I think it's the way we've organized ourselves through history, in communities, trade unions, civil rights movements, the idea of the common good itself, which I think has been kind of lost, at least since the 1960s, and probably before that too. These are all things that we need to pick up on. So, let's encourage reading, but let's also encourage doing, and museums and changing school curriculums. And books are just the beginning, right? They are just the jumping off point. But they have, I think, particularly in a kind of post-truthy kind of age, there's a kind of a weight to a book, a kind of legitimacy to a book, especially if it's got a few footnotes in it. So, I'm. Let me say one more thing. Like, I'm a bit old-fashioned. I like expertise. I've drawn on hundreds and hundreds of academic studies, to find the lessons of history to deal with the climate crisis, risks from AI, threats to democracy, all of that stuff. So let's embrace that old-fashioned idea of, expertise.
And it's so beautifully done as well, because it is an applied history lesson. It's not, history by rote. Here's the things that you have to know. It's like, here's some examples from the past that, hey, might still have some relevance today. And particularly in that framing of the future that Jon was presenting, we need to know that there are a whole load of different twist options other than just opting for fascism and those easy answers which are peddled to us. I wanted to talk a little about the language that you use, Jon, actually, because it's interesting that in that both of you have been using the language of the individual and society, but Jon, you chose to frame that as the consumer story as opposed to the individual story, sort of versus the citizen story versus the collective. I'm just interested in your framing of it as consumer as opposed to individual. Was that a purposeful choice?
I mean, I think it reflects more my journey uh, and my perception of what's actually really going on. Like, I mean, growing up in the advertising industry, you are fun. Like, the word consumer is the word, right? Like, that is how people are talked about, and it and I believe that word is deeply problematic, much more so than individual. Uh, and so, I mean, I've been involved in a little like Roman. I guess I sort of bounce around between various disciplines, and I'm slightly jealous of Roman being able to kind of land himself as historian, because I feel like I need a noun somewhere. But I did some work in social psychology and took some replicated some. I used a polling company to replicate a few different peer-reviewed academic studies with much larger audiences. One of which was we gave a survey of environmental and social motivations to 2,000 people, and we put consumer response study on the front cover for 1,000 people and citizen response study on the front cover for the other 1,000 people, and you get lower social environmental motivation on the consumer response study. So. And similarly, like, there's another one where we did a study where 2,000 people are given a resource dilemma scenario. So you're told you're one of 4 households dependent on a single well for your water supply, and the well's starting to run dry, so you need to use less water. And then you're asked 2 questions: to what extent are you prepared to use less water, and to what extent do you trust the other 3 households to use less water? And for half the sample, for 1,000 people, the word household is swapped with the word consumer. And those people are less willing to compromise and less likely to trust. And so the word consumer is very important. Obviously, it goes way beyond that, but it's not just a choice of name. I think it is actually. And then when you think about how narratives around major political decisions, or even I mean, Roman's already referred to an index that he's been involved in, sort of inspiring, if maybe not yet actually creating. But when you think at the moment, just below GDP, which is much lamented, but no one seems to be able to actually shift, you find the consumer confidence index. And I'm actually much more worried about the consumer confidence index, because I think that's like, whenever a recession is reported, the next thing on the news is you immediately pan to some terrible freaking vox pops outside of a supermarket or a shopping mall, and that is implicitly the role of people in relation to the economy, in relation to society, is the consumer. So the consumer confidence index becomes a carrier of that narrative. So a long-winded way of saying that the word consumer to some degree chose me, because I worked in the advertising industry and I was horrifically exposed to it, and came to see it as something that was structuring how people could think around me, and meaning that I felt like I was an alien because I had some degree of belief in humanity, rather than being prepared simply to accept that the idea that humans are innately self-interested, narrow creatures. But so language matters, really, I guess, is the end note. Like words carry, individual words even carry huge power. And maybe there is a reason why I wrote a book, because I do believe in the power of words.
Can I just add a little something to that?
Please do.
I think it's also worth pointing out that in the 18th century, consumption was a wasting away disease. So, and I think it's kind of that's what consumption is doing to us today. And then I think the other thing, just on individual, I think there was a period when the word individualism was quite healthy in the transition from feudalism. So, in Renaissance Italy, the idea of the individual who was breaking free of feudal bonds to express their creativity and their uniqueness and all this kind of thing was a liberation from social structures at that time. And then individualism became kind of hijacked in a sense by the idea of self-interest, rational economic man, all these different kinds of things which emerged in the 18th and 19th century. So, the word individual, I don't think is inherently evil. Though, I do, when I think about this, I think about the hyper individualism of the 20th century, which we've inherited, which I think has partly come from consumer culture, but then it's also partly come from, for example, the self-help industry. Everyone from Freud to Oprah, getting us to look inside ourselves for the answers. And I like to make a distinction between what I call introspection and outrospection. So, introspection is the idea that we discover who we are and how to live by looking inside ourselves. And outrospection is the idea that we discover who we are and how to live also by stepping into the lives of other people, like what I was talking about, empathy beforehand, about getting beyond that internal reflectionism.
And just to say that distinction, I think, is very helpful. So, and in my work, I would put the lens of subject and consumer onto that shift. Like the subject story is a story of dependence. The consumer story is a story of independence, and versus dependence, independence is a really good thing. But it's just that what we actually need right now is to situate it into interdependence, into connection. But I've been doing a bunch of work recently with some Native American elders. Astonishing stuff. I don't know if you know about this, Roman, but you'll love it if you don't. This is work on the connection between the founding fathers and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy at the time of the founding of the United States. So Benjamin Franklin was in direct, and others were in direct contact with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This is the whole concept of a federation of states actually comes from the Haudenosaunee, which is a confederation of six nations. But there's a whole load of other stuff, and there's a letter that some people I know and are trying to, that we're not sure is real or not, and there's this whole thing, but it seems to suggest that Benjamin Franklin might have said something along the lines of, "I've been wondering if we should have a Declaration of Independence or a Declaration of Interdependence," and you're like, "Oh my God, I hope that's real."
Yeah, I mean, he said a lot of things in Benjamin Franklin, including time is money. He was, so I would be a bit
between consumer and citizen at times.
Yeah, he was big into that. He was a child of the Enlightenment, or a creator of the Enlightenment, rationalism, and all of that kind of stuff.
So you're telling me that letter's probably not real, are you, Roman?
I would say it's probably not real, but I would love to believe it too. So the thing is, maybe it doesn't matter. The point is, it speaks to us, right? It tells us something, like we want to believe that. Like in my book, The Good Ancestor, actually, there's a story. I start one of the chapters about how there's a story that New College, Oxford, when the beams of the roof of the hall were sort of disintegrating, that the college, this is sort of apparently in recent times, that the college fellows knew that in the old records of the college that there had been oak trees planted more than 500 years beforehand for exactly this purpose, to fix the beams of the college hall. And I went and spoke to the archivist at New College, Oxford, found out it was total crap, right? It wasn't true at all, but it didn't matter because it spoke to what we want, which is, in that case, this sense of long-term institutions that get beyond the tyranny of the now, which dominates our politics.
Right, and just because whether Franklin wrote that letter or not, it doesn't mean that we couldn't use the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence to have a series of declarations of interdependence, right? Like you can still just that idea is still valid and alive. That is actually work that's going on, by the way. If people want to check out projectinterdependence.us, kind of reclaiming the heritage of the Haudenosaunee, is live and happening.
And John, as a now reformed ad man, I'm sure you believe in that old adage of never letting the truth get in the way of a good story.
Dude, that cut, man, that cut.
My point being, like, the stories serve so many purposes and come from so many things. And like Roman says, we take the ones that we want to believe in, and it's not that, like, this idea of sorry, I'm meant to be asking the questions, but this idea of a story and truth is so complicated, isn't it? And it's just this thing that we carry with us. And actually, there's so much indigenous wisdom that is carried through stories that aren't held in truth, because it tells us so much more. We've spoken about that a lot on this with I can't remember who we last spoke about. So I wanted to go back to that idea of how would you describe this moment to someone who'd arrived here from the past? And John, you had that magical thing of saying it was like stick or twist, and stick is a broken system, and twist is fascism. Do you want to expand on that, Roman? Do you want to come in? How would you describe this moment to someone from Edo, maybe?
Yeah. So my instinctive response to that is to think that to describe it in terms of our relationship to time, which is that idea that we are trapped in the tyranny of the now, the way that our politicians and policymakers find it hard to see beyond the next election or the latest opinion poll, that businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report, that we're looking at our phones and we're clicking the buy now button. And that sort of domination of the present tense seems to me to underlie, what some people might call the polycrisis or the meta-crisis. I mean, the multiple crises in society, whether it's the ecological emergency, the crumbling of democracy, the risks of AI and genetic engineering, all of these different things, I think are very much tied up with our lack of temporal intelligence, our failure to think both long-term and short-term, forwards and backwards, linear and cyclical. Going back to Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or what people might know as the Iroquois kind of ideas of, cyclical time, for example, that it's the seasons that matter as much as the turnings of the fiscal year and that kind of the electoral cycles. How that interdependence has to be about breaking the tyranny of the clock, and reconstituting our relationships with, or recognizing the different varieties of time. And so, that's how I would go at a sort of an underlying way of sort of thinking about describing this very moment. But just one further thing, when Jonathan Swift wrote Gulliver's Travels, the Lilliputians noticed him checking his watch all the time, and they thought it was his god, right, that he worshipped because he was looking at it so often. So this is not a new idea, right, that obsession. But it does seem to be particularly pertinent today. We're in a moment of kind of clock shock.
I mean, I think there's always a tendency, and I'm wary of being like, I see that as one symptom of my idea, but and like who's is building off who's, and it doesn't really matter, right? Like we're speaking the same thing and offering different perspectives on from something that I think we're very aligned on. But I guess mainly because you've brought the Guns of August into this already, Roman, it's your own fault. But I think this moment, I would argue that nowness, that tyranny of the present tense, is another symptom of the consumer story. That the individual, the contraction temporally and geographically and in terms of agency is all wrapped up in that consumerness. In my mind, it's not just about consumerism, which I see as a word that has a capital C and a hyphen between the R and the ism, isn't just about consumption and stuff. It's about an idea of who we are and what the limits of our agency are, and that is temporal as well, I think. And the way I understand this moment, to sort of put a bit of the background to my stick or twisting, is I think it is very analogous to that Guns of August moment when. And I would describe that time pre-World War One as a time when the story of society was defunct. The subject story at that point in time no longer held, and the aristocrats. There's another great World War One book called Sleepwalkers. I can't remember the author's name. You may have it to hand, but his argument essentially was that World War One was triggered by a kind of crisis of masculinity on the part of the aristocracy because their power was no longer, that had been valid for so long in the face of the rise of the middle class, the idea that there could be a God-given few who could know best and the rest should just sit down and do as they were told, no longer held. And that frayed the confidence of the aristocracy. And so they ended up like posturing stags, kind of awaiting their moment. Those are the words of the writer, Christopher something, can't remember. And I think that's where we are now. Like the consumer story, just as the subject story in that moment was broken, but there wasn't anything to replace it really, and so it was still the dominant story, but it wasn't working anymore, and so we ended up in war. I think we're in a pretty similar moment in relation to the consumer story now. The institutions of the consumer era no longer have legitimacy or validity because they aren't solving the challenges of our time, because they created them. And as a result, the leaders of those institutions trying to stand by methodologies of delivering for people are becoming the posturing stags of the 1910s. And I guess this is where, for me, and maybe I'd love to get into a little of the conversation about like what's the work of this moment in response to that, and how does change happen? How might the things we're trying to make happen actually happen? My great worry, I guess, is that so I think a lot about Lawrence of Arabia. You didn't see my other thing, did you? So
I used to have a Lawrence of Arabia obsession. So I tried to change my university degree to Arabic after watching it in the summer of 1990. Nice. You go on, John.
So after World War One, right? So Lawrence was present at Versailles at the Peace Treaty, and he wrote in Seven Pillars of Wisdom, his autobiography. There's an astonishing little passage where he writes that youth had won, but I'll get this won't be an accurate quote. Live with it. He wrote something like, "Youth had won, but had not learned to keep. And when the dust settled, the old men came out and remade the world in the shape of the former one they knew." And I think. And it was only after World War II, and through the course of World War II, that the work was really done to kind of birth a new era of institutions, and have a paradigm, have a set of structures that could be stepped into. And I guess I'm really, what I'm trying to do, I think, with this work of trying to write a book called A Citizen Manifesto, is say, like, what might the institutions, at least as a sort of rough sketch, what is it that we could be trying to create that could catch this fall? Because there is a collapse. Like I will insist on that until the end of and I think there will be. There is. I mean, we are in the discontinuity, the sort of breakdown now, and I worry. And when I look around the world, I'm launching a new podcast imminently called How to Save Democracy, co-hosted with a Tunisian woman who was an activist in the Arab Spring and then became a politician in Tunisia in the aftermath. And Omzine has this like astonishing perspective of someone who the revolution happened and there was all this hope and positivity, but they couldn't work fast enough to build the institutions that would catch it. And she talks about how dictatorship essentially has returned to Tunisia. And we see it in an awful lot of places. Arguably what's going on in Syria right now is that the moment of hope seems to be kind of dissipating. If we don't have, there's a phrase from from Thomas Kuhn's sort of seminal book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that again I'll paraphrase and make sort of more succinct because I'm an ad man who corrupts things and gets away with it. But it's like, but he wrote something like the failure of a paradigm is not sufficient condition for its replacement. Like you can't implicitly, like you can't have paradigm shift without a paradigm to shift to. And so what I'm really obsessed by in this time is that we have to get propositional on this. Like we can't, it's not enough to reject what we have. We actually have to be sort of putting forward some templates for what this thing can look like. And I'm drawing a lot of that from, and I will draw what I'm writing from a lot of Roman's work looking at history. But I'm interested in. I'm so struck by that. I just feel like we are in this collapse, and my take is it is at the level. It's an equivalent collapse to that happened in the 1910s, and unless we want 2 world wars, not just one, we need to get the hell on with what are the templates that we step into.
Yeah, can I, and maybe I could just add to that I also think this moment is one of chronic failure of imagination, um, particularly historical imagination. So just on the theme of democracy. So the chapter of democracy in History for Tomorrow talks, for example, about how when British colonial forces entered the lands of Igbo communities in today's Nigeria, they were looking for leaders. They were looking for kings and chiefs, and they couldn't find any. Why? Because Igbo communities organized themselves through a form of communal grassroots democracy, where most decisions were made by men and women in village councils, right? And that kind of organization, this is like not just small communities, like tens of thousands of people. And you find these examples in European history between 1524 and 1799 in Switzerland, a place called the Free State of Raetia, which you may not have heard of. And I'd never heard of it till a few years ago. And I used to be a lecturer in the history and practice of democracy, right? I'd never heard of this place. So in this period in Swiss history, there was a republic, the Free State of Raetia, sometimes called the Republic of the Three Leagues, where basically most decisions it was a kind of like an anarchist form of grassroots democracy. Most decisions were made in about 230 neighborhood councils. And then when they had bigger decisions to make, like regional decisions, they would send delegates or like ambassadors up to one of 50 communes. So not elected representatives, just more like a messenger, really. And then they would have a federal assembly, a Bundestag, which would meet a couple of times a year. So this is a model which lasted for over 200 years. And when we think about democracy today, we can hardly think of anything beyond that old-fashioned system invented in the 18th century where we put an X on a ballot sheet every few years. I mean, it's pathetic failure of imagination, given the unbelievable richness of democratic grassroots history. So I absolutely agree, John, that we must be propositional, but the place that we can find propositions in many places. We can try and frame them as sort of utopian visions. And I know you're not a utopian person as far as I see it. I mean, in the best of ways, you're not a utopian person, like positing impossible, perfect dreams. We've got to work with where we are in a fundamental sense, but we need to also just work with what we are capable of. The human story, it doesn't have to be this way, and we need to crack open our historical imagination so that when we're building the propositions, we can say, right, well, they did this in Switzerland. It's not a perfect blueprint, but what can we take from that? And let's merge it together with the idea of citizens' assemblies, because we know that worked pretty well in the last 15 years and it's getting better. And that has its own history going back to, ancient China and parts of indigenous communities in India and ancient Greece and so on. So let us do a bit of that. Let us create through bricolage new kinds of political systems and test them out, and work with technologies like, Audrey Tang in the Taiwanese example. And come on, we can do better than this.
I love the propositional thing. Roman, I thought you might get in the second mention for Milton Friedman of the evening with that idea about, when crisis happens, the change comes from the ideas that are lying around. And we've got the ideas lying around in a way that we didn't have with the 2008 financial crash. But to develop that, I guess I wanted to ask, who if we frame these propositional things as propositional stories, possibilities, stories of possibility, who are the stories for? Are they for the people, or are they for people who are currently holding power and looking to 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 to, to pass that on in some way?
Jon, we want to hear from you. Who are the stories for?
So you asked me on a really interesting day, because I'm in Brussels, because I've been speaking with politicians at European level today. Uh, I so what I fundamentally believe that they're for all of us, and that actually the real work, a huge proportion of the real work is to be building these propositions where we are, where we live, without asking for permission. And I think people are doing that, whether I talk about the East Marsh United crew in Grimsby, who've become some of my closest friends, or whether I talk about the Taiwanese COVID response that actually started with a hacker movement called GovZero, like building their own imagination of how government should work on, and reifying it in websites. Or I talk about the bioregional movement, and that's this sort of thing, that bioregional governance that's taking shape across the world. People just sort of saying, well, actually, I don't really believe that I live in Bristol. I believe I live in the Avon bioregion. So we're going to start to figure out how to organise on that basis, and we'll do it a bit differently and draw on ideas like Roman Krznaric's. But I also, I guess, I mean, particularly. Sorry, you can tell this is a bit of an edge of my learning, actually, an edge of my thinking. But I guess I'm like, when I look at the case studies I've looked at, it for a transition to happen, it does seem to require some folk in positions of power and influence to be willing to open the door to it, not to lead it actually, but to be willing to allow it. So in Taiwan, the GovZero movement would have remained, I've interviewed people who used exactly these words, would have remained an art project had the Speaker of the Parliament not endorsed the Sunflower Revolution protest and acknowledged the role of GovZero in it. In Ireland, the Citizens' Assembly mechanic that's part of the Irish constitutional structure became that after a group of academics ran a pilot citizens assembly from outside of government, but only transitioned in once Enda Kenny and a few other, as Deputy Taoiseach and a few others, actually validated that, listened to it, and then commissioned the next process. So yeah, I mean, like I could go on and on with those examples, but there seems my hypothesis that I'm drawing from this research is that there is some need for someone, not loads of people, and certainly not as leaders, but allowers, and therefore I do think there's an importance of articulating these stories in ways that can be heard by people in existing positions of power and influence, if only because otherwise they will block it, and that will make things a lot more painful. And my great worry in this time, frankly, is that, and I said this today, and it caused a bit of a ruckus, but like that by sticking within this kind of consumer frame, by with all goodwill, trying to defend existing structures of democracy from those who are trying to break them, and it is a real threat. But by trying to defend what we have rather than open up into a citizen story, by seeing it as a binary between, I would articulate it as consumer and subject, and therefore defend consumer democracy from the rise of the subject, rather than open into citizen. What they're actually doing, because consumer democracy cannot work, is they're ultimately pushing people into the arms of fascism, because all that's being offered is stick or twist. And so I guess where I get to is I do think people in positions of existing power and influence are an important audience, and that is, I think, who I will be writing for, at least, if not primarily, then certainly secondarily.
Roman,
who are the stories for?
Yeah.
You know, one of the ways that I think about how rapid transformative change happens, which is what I think we need, given the plethora of crises that we face. And I agree with John that we are in the breakdown, but I think it's worse than before leading up to the First World War. I'm thinking of I think about on sort of civilizational levels, Assyrian collapse, Roman Empire collapses, this kind of thing. Um, I think of one of the ways I think transformative change happens at speed and scale is through a model what I call the disruption nexus, which is in the end of this book, History for Tomorrow, where basically, if you look historically at moments of big change, three things tend to have come together. And this is an answer to the question, I think. Um, Crisis, ideas, and movements. So if you think about the fall of state socialism in East Germany in 1989, Berlin Wall, right? You had a crisis of leadership in the East German government. They were all arguing over how to respond to Gorbachev's reforms, right? So there were big divisions there, very, very important. The second thing you had were ideas. You had ideas around old ideas, in this case, democratic freedom and freedom of movement, freedom of speech. And then you had movements. You had the great uprisings in Leipzig in October 1989. And then in November 1989, early November, you had a series of protests, uprisings, citizens' movements, and finally the breaching of the wall on November the 9th. All those three things came together. And as you alluded to, Tim, earlier, when it came to the financial crash in 2008, we had the crisis of the crash itself. We had the movements in the form of Occupy, which, agreeing probably here with John, one of the big failures there was the failure to be propositional. But what was lacking, I think, particularly were the big ideas, the new economic models, which I think we've got more of today. Donor economics, degrowth, well-being economics, economy stuff, all of those things. But back then, what we ended up doing was bailing out the old system. And I think there was ideas like, so when it comes to who are the stories for, I think of it in this triangular way. I think we need the stories to empower the movements of people on the ground, citizens' movements, and so on. We need the stories that can help the ideas generators. They, in a way, they are the story creators, but they can also receive the stories too. Whether it's think tanks or writers, artists, all the people who feed into that. And then you also need the stories that target the elites to create divisions in them. Because as John's saying, unless there's the space for change, the inertia of the system and the power of the system will crush it. And there's a lot of, political scientists have studied this for over a century, that one of the ways you get the rise of democracy historically is when you have a division in the elites. Historically, classically, it's between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy, right? Why did Britain become a representative democracy? Because the bourgeoisie sided a little bit with the working classes against the aristocracy. Why did Latin America remain basically feudal throughout the 20th century? Because the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy were the same. They were intermarried, interlinked. They weren't divided, right? That's a famous theory by a guy called Barrington Moore, Social Origins of Democracy and Dictatorship. But the point is, you need the story, certain kinds of stories which target those in power and can potentially divide them. So you take some of them away from the old stories that legitimize the system.
I just want to say I find that very powerful and very helpful, actually, and I hadn't drawn that from my reading as yet, so I'm going to come back to you.
I tell you, someone who's really good on this topic is Anthony Barnett, the great democracy thinker. But he's really big, particularly on the elite divisions, why that's so important.
I haven't had that conversation with him either, and I need to, and that helps me with my day to day, because I feel like there were some who were going with me pretty hard, and some who were fighting back pretty hard. And it's an awkward place to be in when you feel like what you're trying. I mean, I'm like part man, part Labrador, right? Like I want people to like me. But maybe if I think of what I'm trying to do actually as being to create some division and not be liked by everyone, that's
I think it's uncomfortable and healthy,
Wow. I'm sort of lost for words, that because we're sort of running out of time. And you mentioned earlier, John, about being frustrated in some of the work that you're doing now. and I was going to come back to it, but was that one of the areas of frustration? What do I do in this situation when I can't be liked by everyone?
No, I think it's more that I feel like I'm in a moment where I have had a good few years of having put a book into the world that I had thought through really hard and believe in what's in there. And now I'm coming to another edge where I'm like, okay, so how do we actually do this in time? Or like, maybe that's the wrong phrase, right? But I feel like I do have some ideas that build on a lot of the ideas that Roman and I have referred to in this conversation already, but I'm not getting through to the people I want to get through to. And this is, and I, yeah. So basically what I'm saying, the frustration comes of my brain being a couple of steps ahead of what I've put out into the world in a way that I can argue from it. And so that's probably time to be writing again.
But this is the work of now, isn't it? That's what we're saying, is that we need to craft this so that it's effective in the moment in which it's needed. And yeah, Jon, congratulations. Well done for being the first person to mention collapse on the podcast. I mean, we've had Jeremy Lent, we've had Manda Scott, we've had lots
Manda
of
Scott mentioned collapse.
I don't think Manda did mention collapse. We talked about myth and narrative and grounding, and it was beautiful. So thank you for being the first person to mention collapse, as far as my terrible memory goes. But for holding that with that radical hope. It's not like, collapse is coming, all go off and buy your claustrophiles. I've been reading Ben Elton's fabulous satire, Another Eden, where everyone goes off and walls themselves into like a little Anderson shelter to deal with the end of the world. And we're not there, are we? We are kind of cultivating our radical hope that another way is possible. And that's what both of your books do absolutely bloody brilliantly. I mean, like, it's beautiful to bring you both together and have this conversation and watch kind of the sparks fly between you and those that kind of those dawnings and that thing. This is what we need. So thank you both for the books and thank you for this conversation. I guess I always like to close, because we often touch on collapse, even if we don't talk about it. I want to touch on where you find that hope, that active hope, the radical hope, not the hopium that you talk about in the book room. Where do you find that hope for the future that's truly grounded?
Come on, Ray.
Okay,
I'll go first once, mate.
Where I find hope is in two tiny little words: as if. As if. And what I mean by that is we always have to act as if change is possible, because from what I've seen through history, it is. And, if you think of those who campaigned against British colonialism in India, they probably thought, look, we're never going to overthrow this huge, powerful colonial monstrosity. But they acted as if they could, and that's what radical hope is about for me. It's being, unlike the glass half fullness of optimism, where you think everything's going to be okay in spite of the evidence. I'm not optimistic about the state of the world, but I'm hopeful in the sense of being committed to the values and the visions that you have, even when the odds are against you. And the two words "as if" are what get me out of bed in the morning, because if we can act as if change is possible, well, I'm a hopeful person ultimately, and I think like Jon, and we just need those little kernels of possibility, and for me, they're captured in those two words.
I love that. I mean, someone said something to me recently that was even less about outcomes. He just said, this guy Cole Mannix, who runs a sort of regenerative agriculture community wealth building initiative out of a ranch in the middle of Montana, which is now a thoroughly red state. And Cole had this thing he just said to me, in a way, I'm not doing this because I believe we can win. I'm doing this because this makes life worth living. This is a life I want to live. This is a life of dignity, and I don't know, like maybe an Ece Temelkuran, the Turkish writer who wrote Together and How to Lose a Country, has this lovely thing. She's like, sometimes we might need to act even if there isn't any hope. And maybe this bridge between like acting as if and acting from dignity, like actually the places of like faith in humanity, faith in ourselves, belief, like, and belief in ourselves is not a, it's much harder actually than sort of out there like dependent on outcome. It's like we just got to do it, like regardless. And I think that's, I don't know.
That's great for a t-shirt. We just got to do it.
Just got to do it. Just got to
Really?
do it.
You should work in advertising.
Yeah, I should go back to that. No.
But that what you summed it up beautifully there, because that belief is what you are both offering readers, people who move in the circles where they meet people who've read your books. You know, these ideas that you've captured spread beyond just the book, beyond the people who've read it. They really do ripple out, and I just want to say thank you for that in the most meaningful way that I can say thank you without bursting into tears, because I can feel that coming as well. Thank you for these beautiful books. Thank you for the beautiful work, and thank you for joining us and sharing just a tiny sliver of that. I'm so sorry for those of you who weren't able to make it. We've recorded it all. It's here in posterity. You can watch it back. But yeah, for those of you who were able to make it, well done. Good work, but gold star. And yeah, Jon, Roman, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Let's do this. Just gotta do it.
As if we could.
As if we can.
Thanks
Good
so
night,
much.
folks.
Bye.
Amazing. Thank you, guys.